Thanks very much, Maddie. A very good morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. As Maddie said, Ben Carnell, Head of Client Solutions from Sentis, and here today to talk about how to become a safety culture change agent. This is a topic in particular for myself that I'm quite passionate about. So I'll try and keep a little bit of a lid on the passion so that we do finish in time as well. Not only that, though, is that this topic is particularly relevant right now, given the current landscape. And I'm sure many of you have seen different commentary around and whatnot, that with the changes we've gone through over the last couple of years, the obvious, but likewise some of those other changes is there's now almost never been a better time in terms of initiating change and shaking things up, I guess, in terms of where you want to start to shift your organization, particularly from a safety culture point of view as well. In terms of, as Maddie has just introduced, so I oversee all our different client partnerships alongside a wonderful team here at Sentis. For those that haven't heard of Sentis before, we are a consulting company that works in the safety culture space and looks at a range of different things that tie into safety culture, namely leadership, culture, as the name suggests, well-being, and likewise critical risk as well. This is part of our mission as an organisation, and you'll see this narrative start to come through. For those that haven't been exposed to Sentis previously, you'll start to see this narrative come through in shifting the language that sits around safety, and that it's there to protect us for something rather than just there to protect us from something. So you'll see very much that narrative come through in who we are as a business and how we partner with different organizations to help them shift their safety cultures and help their individuals and likewise their organizations go home for the better every day. With respect to today's handout, you'll see here a bit of a model that we'll refer to at different points throughout today's webinar. Likewise, what you've got as part of that as well is what we call the start, stop, continue. So an opportunity to reflect on, okay, well, across those different areas, what do I need to start doing? What might be some things I need to stop doing? And what are some things actually that, and this is important, that I'm doing really well that I might need to continue doing as well? So to invite you, whether on that handout, wherever you want to capture those notes, just to capture a couple of things at least under each of those titles, and then revisit it over the next few weeks as well. I want to just to kick us off is share a story about a company called Ørsted. Now, Ørsted is a Danish energy giant, and they have gone through what has been one of the biggest transformations of any company, certainly over the last few decades. Back in 2004, and some of you may have heard of the Ørsted journey. Back in 2004, as an energy company, about 90% of their energy production was based on fossil fuels, about 90%. So the rest of it starting to look into the renewable space. They went through a bit of a process where since 2004 and right through to the shift of about a couple of years ago, around back to 2019, where they've actually switched those percentages around. So they've gone from 2004 being 90% fossil fuels rather, to now being 90% renewables. For a company of that size and that nature of work, that is a huge transformation to undertake. And naturally, as I'm sure you're starting to think through, okay, what would that look like for a company of that size, is you start to think through all the changes that they needed to communicate, not just internally, but likewise to different stakeholders that sit externally, to the public, to government, to whatnot, of that change to go from 90% fossil fuels through to 90% renewables in the space of around about 15 years. They went on and it was actually launched quite publicly in terms of the journey that they were going to go on from undertaking that change to really flip their business model around in terms of what that would look like. One of the fascinating things about this is the change that they went on wasn't straightforward. It wasn't an easy process. It wasn't without its roadblocks. It wasn't without its hurdles. It wasn't without its pushback. At a point there, their revenue was down by 40%. They're actually facing a lot of backlash from the public. At one point there, they dropped right down to their lowest point in terms of, you know, one of the most trusted organizations over in that space of Europe there. And so they were up against it time after time, particularly through the period of 2012 through to 2016. You even look at that internally, and whilst this may not be publicly known, the sort of pushback that any company might get going from, this is our business model, this is the work we do, to actually flipping that round to, we're now actually going to operate in the renewables space. They came under, you know, intense financial and had to divest a whole heap of assets of theirs. They went through quite a brand crisis as well through that, but were still able to come out on the other side now over the last few years to where they're now actually, in terms of wind energy, they own about 30% of the market worldwide, which is about twice what their nearest competitor is. Very, very well known worldwide for the transformation they've gone through from a company, again, fossil fuel driven, to now actually being one of the most trusted companies in that particular space, and actually viewed as one of the most sustainable companies in the world. The fascinating thing about this transformation that they've undertaken is also the impact that it started to have outside of their organization, and more of in the private market as well, into this climate change journey that's now just not government driven, but it's actually being driven by a private company, in this case Ørsted. One of the fascinating quotes from their exec team comes from that their whole transformation was driven around this notion that business as usual is no longer going to cut it. And I thought that is a really, really good reflection, a really good quote for all of us, particularly over the last few years, that this notion of business as usual is just not going to cut it. What I'll invite you to reflect on as we go through this journey and unpack this Ørsted story is how they went about that change. How they went about that change through Harvard Business Review has actually ranked them. They did a bit of a story a little while ago, an article, has ranked them 7th in terms of the biggest organizational transformations over the last period of time. So an incredible transformation. And I'll invite you to think as we go through the content for today's webinar, what all those hurdles, what all those obstacles might have been that they might have been up against, and how they might have applied some of the principles to get through that journey as well. I'll also throw out the invite now, very well worth a watch, and we'll do it much better justice than what I talk to, is put their name into YouTube. They've got a couple of videos there that talk through the change process. There's one there around the change process, goes for about 18 minutes. Very well worth a watch to understand some of those hurdles they come up against, which for many organizations, those sorts of hurdles would invite them, or almost push them to just bunker down and just keep doing what they're doing. They instead continue to push, continue to challenge, continue to look forward to where they're now 90% renewables, and still wanting to improve beyond that as well, which is incredible. So let's unpack that a little bit further, and you'll be able to see this model in your handout. But the first thing Ørsted did is they were very deliberate around listening to the data. A business of that size, of that sort of nature of work, can be very easily to dismiss the data, and that goes for just about any organization. But around about that 2004, early 2000s, is you're starting to get different data sources come out, you know, Al Gore, those sorts of reports that were coming out in documentaries, and starting to see where the world was going to actually head. And we know the story around the degrees of change there, but where the world was going to head over the subsequent few decades. They did a really good job of going, the writing's on the wall for us. We're going to have to undertake not just a small, we'll just tweak, or we'll just sort of change the way we do things just slightly. We're going to have to transform our business right almost a 180 in terms of where they headed. They formed a very strong steering committee as part of that to lead the change, and we'll talk to that in a little bit more detail as we undertake this. The next thing they did is they created a very clear strategy, and if you get a moment, I think they demonstrate it quite well. If you jump on their website and different articles around, you can see the strategy that they put in place in terms of, here's our vision, here's where we want to be, here's how that cascades down into the values, into the sorts of operating rhythms that we have as a business. The next thing that they did, which is quite important, is how they then went about implementing the change. And this is probably one of the key things that separates them from some other very well-known similar organizations and global businesses where their transformation process has actually come unstuck. Is that some of those other organizations have had incredible visions around where they want to head and what it looks like for them in sort of 10, 15 years time. Where it's come unstuck, though, is when we get to implementing this plan. And that's a little bit of where we're going to spend today's session as well. A quote that comes from one of the articles that describes the change is, as with the Ørsted transformation, while it's essential to have a clear vision and long-term strategy, it's important to give all stakeholders the time and space to accept the situation as it is, and then start to buy into and embed the vision. One of the things you'll notice we go through today's topic is I would be confident saying that I'm preaching a lot to the converted here, is that a lot of us know the process through which change and what that needs to look like, but we're also all human and we want to get through that change process both individually and likewise with our teams, with our organizations, as quickly as we possibly can. What I'll invite you to do as we go through different topics in today's webinars is to reflect, where am I perhaps missing this, or where am I spending too much time focusing on this, or where's this roadblock likely to pop up along this change journey, and almost buy into that notion that sometimes change is a little bit around going slow to go fast, so that we don't miss some of these crucial steps. So onto the agenda for today, and we'll reflect back on the Ørsted journey at different points there as well. Is the first thing we're going to unpack is the brain and change. So how does change actually happen in the brain? What do those processes look like at an individual level? Because that's also then crucial to then understanding how that happens at an organizational level. The next thing we're going to unpack is, what does it look like to get stakeholder buy-in? What are some of those key steps that we need to together in order to make sure that we've got buy-in from the key stakeholders and aligned buy-in as well? Then we're going to jump into looking at, okay, what does it look like to manage objections and roadblocks, and what are some of the things that we might miss that can help facilitate those? But likewise, where might we see some roadblocks and how do we overcome those as well? And then lastly, we'll jump back into that roadmap for success and unpack that in a little bit more detail. So the first topic I want to jump into is this notion of the brain and change. And we're all, very well accomplished professionals, and we understand, we've probably read lots of, articles or done some development in this notion of organizational change. And I dare say that's part of the reason that you're jumping into today's webinar as well. What you'll hear a lot of commentary on is that people hate change. And I'm sure we've heard that quote before in different variations. The reality of it is that people don't hate change. I'd actually go so far as to say it's the other end of the spectrum, is that we actually love change in most instances. What we don't like as humans, though, is the process through which we get that change. Sometimes that process can be years, sometimes that process can be a few days, but we don't like the process to get to a particular change outcome. More often than not, we'll be able to find some instances where that's not the case. But part of the reason why that's the case, the majority of the time, is because the change requires consuming, and the brain consuming, a lot of energy. It has to expel a lot of energy in order to change, however long that, or whatever change that might be. It requires the brain using more energy. One of the things we know about the brain is that the brain loves to conserve energy. So this notion of change then requiring us to use more energy for when we might already have a process or a habit or whatever that might look like, the brain goes, well, hang on, I've already got a process, or I've already got a way of doing A, B, C. Why would I use more energy to get just a slightly different, or maybe even a bigger difference in outcome as part of this process? I want to conserve the energy. And an example of this, and a couple of years ago, I had to have some shoulder surgery, which meant that I couldn't use my right arm, and I had to go about brushing my teeth with my left hand. I cannot describe the amount of not just energy from an arm point of view, yes, using my non-dominant hand, but the cognitive energy to think through how I'm actually going about brushing my teeth. The whole time my brain is going, let's just find a way to use my dominant hand because I don't have to really think about that. It's habitual. Using my left hand, though, is I had to use a lot of energy in order to buy into that change. The fascinating thing for that is that once I was able to use this shoulder again, straight back to using my dominant hand, because my brain even then goes, hey, yes, we've sort of learned how to use the left hand here, but we can conserve even more energy switching back to the old way of doing things. I think we'll start to see some of that notion come out as we go through today's topic. The other thing about change is that people don't change until the benefits of changing outweigh staying the same. So we can, we can sell the message around change, we can push the benefits that are going to come through change, but until they outweigh the current state, only then will people start to entertain the idea of possibly changing either individually, at a team, or at an organizational level. When we go through the process of change and talking through this notion of using more energy, what we're actually asking the brain to do is to create different or more neural pathways. That's a little bit like walking through a field that hasn't been mowed or had a pathway before. That requires the brain to use a bit more energy to create that pathway, as opposed to using the pathway that has already existed, that's already there. So I want to jump into this model here, which is the stages of change model. And many of you would have seen this model before. It's been around for many decades in the psychology space there. It was actually first developed in the health psychology realm of understanding what are the processes that people go through when they're going to change some form of health behavior, whether that be getting fitter, giving up smoking, whatever that might be. These are the stages that an individual goes through from both an attitudinal, but likewise a behavioral perspective as well. The first stage is what we call pre-contemplation. And if an individual is at the pre-contemplation stage, it has not even crossed their mind that they might need to change. Hasn't even crossed their mind. At the contemplation phase, as the or stage rather, as the name suggests, this is where at an individual level and likewise a team level, is people start to go through, okay, what would an alternative look like? If, is there another way of doing this? Could I do this differently? Have I always just been operating off habit and maybe I haven't taken the time to think about how I just need to change things up a little bit? We start to weigh things up. At this stage, it's very much those comparisons tend to be sort of like for like, as we haven't chosen one over the other. We're just weighing it up to kind of go, okay, what would be the pros, what would be the cons, etc., etc. At the preparation stage, this is where we start to go through, okay, well, if I am to change, what are the things that I need to put in place in order to change? What do I need to remove? What do I need to put in place? What do I need to get more of? What do I need to do less of? What's that change actually going to look like, and what's that going to mean for me on a day-to-day basis? At the action phase, this is where we then commit to the change. Okay, great. I understand what I need to do now. I'll buy into that change. The maintenance phase then, as the name suggests, is where that change is then maintained over a long time. An example of this is, let's say I need to, and my physio says I need to go to the gym more and I need to increase my fitness. If I'm at pre-contemplation, that thought has not even crossed my mind. The physio might even say it to me and I don't even hear it. I just go, great, thanks for the appointment, see you next time. That hasn't even crossed my mind that I might need to increase my fitness and maybe even eat a little bit healthier, whatever that might look like. At the contemplation stage, this is where I start to go, oh, actually, maybe I do need to operate a little bit differently, or maybe I do need to, go to the gym or go for some walks, or, a little bit less Uber Eats throughout the week. I start to weigh it up. Then I get to the preparation stage. And at the preparation stage, this is where I start to probably jump into more of that research phase, is to look at, okay, well, what are the things I would need to change on my day-to-day lifestyle and my day-to-day habits? This might be, okay, I need to go and look at the gyms around my area and see which is going to be the best gym for me to go to. I might need to go, hey, look, the runners that I've got are pretty old. I need to go and get some new runners. This might look like, hey, I probably need to, change the structure of my day so I can get to the gym at this particular time, or I've got time to do the meal prep, etc., etc. The action phase is then when I then put the runners on and I head down to the gym, and then I come back and I cook a healthy meal. That's what action looks like. And I'm sure we've all gone through a similar process. That's great for a week, 2 weeks, but then it's very easy to fall back into the old habit of doing things. That's where the maintenance phase kicks in, is how do I make sure I'm motivated, energized to keep that change going? So how do we influence change? Taking this back away from my shift to become a fitter human is now we actually start to look at, okay, what does this look like from a change perspective in an organizational setting? And what does this look like when we're actually managing complex change, of which I'm sure you all know, that's what safety culture is. Safety culture change is a complex change process. I'll draw your attention to the Nostal model of complex change, which some of you may have seen previously. And what this model describes is all the different things that we need to have in place in order to enact successful change, whatever that might look like. This applies whether I'm the the CEO of Orsted and we're going to go from fossil fuel focus to now renewable focus. The same principle applies if now we're not going to do this process on a Monday morning, we're actually going to do this process on a Tuesday afternoon. All of these principles apply in just the same way, to varying degrees, of course. To move through those stages of change, we need all 6 of these areas. What you'll find is that where you're trying to enact organizational change, which is, in a sense, moving a group of people through these stages here, is what you'll find is that a roadblock or a hurdle will pop up somewhere along this journey here. To move people through the contemplation stage, is what we first need is a vision, and we need consensus on what that change is going to look like. So what's the outcome from the change and what are we trying to achieve? And making sure that we've got consensus or buy-in around what that process is going to look like. To move people through the preparation stage, this is about making sure that people have the skills, that they know what they need to do in order to buy into and accept and then drive the change over a long time. The incentives is and often referred to as the WIFM factor, is what's in it for me. So for those that are going to be buying into, supporting, driving the change and being part of that change, what's in it for them to jump on board with the change? So making sure I've got incentives in place. The next thing is resources, is making sure that people have the appropriate resources in order to be able to support that change, whatever that's going to look like. Those 3 things help an individual, likewise the team, likewise the organization, move through that preparation stage of get the things they need in place in order to go, great, we can jump into action here. The action plan is then what gets us into action and then locks that in. The action plan is about understanding, okay, what's it going to look like on almost a day-to-day basis for us to drive and make this change and then to operate with this change in place. If we're going to shift the safety culture from being driven, through these sorts of attitudes here to now these being the founding attitudes that drive our safety culture, what does that action plan look like to get us from A through to point B? The maintenance phase is then about making sure those things continue to be in place and are tweaked along the way to make sure that that change is sustained over time. So I want to start with that first stage here, and I'll jump back to that stages of change model. Is that typically when organizational change initiatives get introduced, and this might be we're going to shift the safety culture, this might be we're going to change our business model from focusing on, well, I'll go back to the Orsted example, from fossil fuels through renewables, whatever that change process might be, is we have a tendency as humans to want to jump straight into action for 2 reasons. The first reason is that we want to get through the stages of change as quickly as possible, because moving through the stages of change does require a level of cognitive energy, both individually and then likewise collectively. The other reason we have a tendency to jump straight through to action is that for those leading the change, which will often be those here on this call, for those leading the change, is for us, it makes sense in our head why we would need to change. We've had a safety culture that's got some unhelpful attitudes, perhaps fueling the safety culture. We've been doing some things in a bit of an old school mentality. We need to shift that. We need to create, I'll use our terminology, what we would call a citizenship safety culture. Now, for us as individuals, we've gone through each of those stages of change. We can see why we would want to shift. We can see what it would take to get there. We can see what the good outcome is going to look like. And then we go straight to the organization and go, hey, here's what it's going to look like. Let's start. The reason why that falls over is that we haven't taken people through those stages of change. We haven't allowed people on their own journey. I'm going back to the quote at the start of the webinar, that journey for people to actually understand, buy into, and then start to support that change. So the first step in rolling out a safety culture change process, or what initiative, project, whatever that looks, or journey is probably the more suitable term. It's about making sure that we've got a clear picture and that all of the key stakeholders are aligned on what that picture is going to look like. So I want to jump back into this model here, and we'll jump back and forth between the two here. Without a vision, is what you'll often find is that people feel, and we're going through a change process, there's not a clear vision around what that change needs to look like, and what from A through to B needs to look like, or what the current safety culture is through to what the ideal safety culture is. If that is not a clear picture of what that journey and what that outcome is going to look like, is what you'll find is people are confused. People are not sure, okay, I know we need to improve, but I'm not sure what that's going to look like. I'm not sure, you know, and again, it's an easy trap for us to fall into, because we can go, well, it makes sense what it's going to look like. But unless it's well articulated, it's hard for people to go, okay, I can see what that change is. I'm happy to jump on board and help drive that journey as well. Without that vision, you'll see confusion start to pop up for a lot of people, and this is particularly worrying when you've got key stakeholders that you need to help drive this change as well. Part of that vision, and this is where I've seen a lot of visions come undone, is it's not a well articulated story around what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve that as well. An example of that, let's say I said to everyone on this call, you happen to be in the office here, and let's say I said, look, we're actually going to change the way we're doing things. I actually want everyone to meet in the city. Now, what I've given there, and I go with this example here, is I've provided a bit of a picture of the outcome, or a vision of, hey, I want us to meet in the city. And as part of that, I want everyone to use only one mode of transport, whatever that might be. Great, so we've sort of got a bit of a vision, but it's not really well articulated, and everyone's going to sort of make their own journey there. And what you'll start to see is that people go, great, I'll call an Uber in order to get to that outcome, or, you know, I'll take my own car, or, you know, if I've got time, I'll take one of those scooters, or I'll catch a bus, I'll walk in if I want to. You start to see people take different journeys in order to get there. The fascinating thing, though, about this, and I guess in this example, is that you'll see people make their way into the city, but you'll end up with people I'll end up rather with people in different locations within that city. You start to see people calling each other going, hey, whereabouts in the city are you? Where do you know where we need to meet? And all of a sudden you've got people spaced out. The interesting thing, though, for me, though, is that with that sort of example, is people will come up against roadblocks along that journey. It's things that get in their way from getting to the city. It's the car breaks down, or I'm right on the outskirts of the city, but the traffic's got really busy, or, you know, my Uber had to drop me off, or whatever, or here's the only place I could find a park. And so you end up with this scattered alignment towards that vision. Had I said to everyone, though, I want us to head into the city, take your own transport in your own time at some point today, and I want us to meet in the shopping mall in the centre there, right in the middle, right next to Hungry Jack's as an example. Now, I've been a bit more articulate in that vision and what good looks like. The key thing for me as part of this is that as people make their way in to achieve that outcome, as different obstacles pop up, because the outcome is well articulated, people will actually themselves find ways to problem solve along that journey. Is what it looks like is great. The scooter I was using to get in has now run out of power. Oh, well, I'm in the city, so I've ticked it. But no, if I need to be here, and by, let's say, that particular time, is what I'll do is I'll go and find another scooter to get in there, or, I'll catch a lift with someone along the way. Is people actually start to problem solve because the vision is very well articulated. I'm providing that example because I see a lot of visions that are very high level, and yes, they sound great, but they're not well articulated in terms of this is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and we want to make sure that everyone's aligned on that as well. The next thing in terms of getting stakeholders is to make sure there's consensus. And this is a fine balance, particularly for yourselves in leading this change, is between making sure that you don't get into direction by dictatorship, for want of a better term. Likewise, making sure that you don't get into analysis paralysis. You want to make sure that there's alignment and that people are on board with A, the need, and B, what the outcome's going to look like. Without that, particularly from your critical key stakeholders, not just the stakeholders that are easy to engage with, this is all of your critical key stakeholders, and some of them may take longer to get to this consensus. Without that, as you'll see sabotage over the long term, it may not be that overt sabotage or that pushback, sometimes it will be, but over time, as you'll start to see people just start to step back from what that change process looks like, or not buy into, or not support it, or give it quite that tokenistic, yeah, I'll support it, but that's all. They're not going to drive it. So without that consensus, you'll start to see that sabotage process as well. So, and yeah, as I said, resisting the change there. So how do you get people from that pre-contemplation through to contemplation ready for preparation? Well, vision and making sure you've got consensus are the key things. The first thing you need to do is to make sure you understand your stakeholders. Now, this is important to do well before the change process is going to kick in, is making sure that you've got time to know people's functions of the business, their roles, and you understand a little bit what sort of impact a change might have on their part of business. Where I've seen this come undone slightly sometimes is where people try and understand the stakeholders, but when the change has already been announced, or change has been initiated, or the need to change has already been initiated, and because people haven't been understood prior to that process, you don't get the pushback, but you start to see people start to dig their heels in just a little bit, and it makes it just a little bit more difficult in order to drive that change. Know who your key stakeholders are in the change you're going to be initiating, and start to understand what sort of impact it's going to have on them from the outset of what that's going to look like as well. The next thing is the power of data, is making sure that you've captured data from a range of different sources. Where this can come undone is, and this is the value of what we would call evidence-based practice, is not just grabbing a single data point or a single set of data points, is grabbing data from a range of different sources to help make the case for change. And that in itself will then actually help get consensus for what the change needs to look like. You know, I know for myself, if at the moment I'm looking for an electrician. Now, in looking for an electrician, I'm going to look on some Google reviews. I'm going to ask some people, you know, what are some good electricians that we use? Perhaps some, you know, community chats on social media and whatnot. I'm grabbing data, I'm grabbing data from a few different sources so that I can make the best decision possible for the work I need to get done. The same applies for cultural change, is gathering data, and this might be safety culture diagnostic data. This is looking at some of the metrics and not just what the metrics say, but the story that the metrics are telling as well. This might be getting views or opinions from key parts of the business. It might be benchmarking externally, it's benchmarking internally, it's working with another organization that's doing things well. It's grabbing data from a few different sources to help make the case for change as strong as you possibly can. Just grabbing a small piece of data or one piece of data is often, particularly if you're up against some pushback, is often not enough to make the case for change. So grabbing robust, comprehensive data that's going to help tell you the story you need to enact that change. The next one is around storytelling. You're setting a clear vision of where you are now, but likewise where you want to get to, is you've got to appeal to the emotional brain, and that's around the story that sits beyond that. So, for example, looking at actually a director of a company recently, he described the story of what they wanted to achieve as part of their safety culture is didn't just go with that, we want to just create zero harm. Great, we all see the value in that and we can support that, but there's not much of a story to it. Instead, what he described is over his career, the instances where he has had to deliver quite sad and unfortunate news. The value in that, and quite unfortunate stories he was sharing, but the value in that is creating a story around why that organization wants to get to zero harm. And that story is what people are able to resonate with, particularly those stakeholders at the early stage is key. With these two things is what you'll start to get, and you'll all be familiar with, your normal distribution of how people buy into the change, is you start to get those early adopters on board. Because these are the ones that are, it's your 13.5%, if you're familiar with the normal distribution curve there, that are ready to jump on board. They just need to understand, or they're ready to change. They just need to understand what it's going to look like, and all align to what that's going to look like as well. Where we see a lot of organizations come undone, and perhaps some of you on this call might have come undone at this stage here, is they think that that's the key part to driving the change. Once you've got a clear vision, once you've got people aligned or the key stakeholders aligned, great, that's the hard part of the change process. The hard part is actually then when you get to implementing that change. And this is where I want to jump into, moving from that preparation to the action phase that's necessary to get an organizational change process going. I'm sure you would have seen quotes like this before. It's, the vision is all well and good, but what's my role in this? I don't see how my role is going to play a part in this. This is all well and good, but what if it doesn't work? Or, so I can see what you're trying to achieve, but so it's going to sit with us to try and actually achieve this. Meanwhile, you've just created the fancy documents around what that change is going to look like. Or how are we possibly going to find time to put this change in place? One of the things you'll note around some of these quotes here, and you'll have some in your own organization as well, is that change as a process is often treated as a purely rational exercise. You can't put a change process is not just solely it's not a branding exercise or a marketing exercise just in and of itself. It's actually quite an emotive process for a lot of people to go through. So understanding, well, how do we see what are some of those emotions that are coming through from people? And then how do we actually make sure that we're providing what we need to help people work through those emotions to get onto that change process is really key. So what does it look like to move from the contemplation through preparation into that action phase? Without the necessary skills for people to buy into and support that change, is what you start to see is people having a level of anxiety around what that change is looking like. So my invitation here would be to actually almost reverse engineer that and to look at, okay, we'll make sure we've got the skills, but to also check back and see, okay, we're seeing people that are quite anxious around this change process. What that's probably alluding to is that we've missed a step here, or we haven't comprehensively enough covered off on making sure that people have the skills to actually execute on that change and whatever that's going to look like. If I ask someone who's never driven in the city of Sydney before to jump in the car and drive me from point A to point B, you're going to see some anxiety coming through because they don't yet feel they have the skills. Recognizing that anxiety in an organizational change process is really key to go, great, let's push the brakes just a sec and let's step back and go, how do we make sure that these people or this individual has the necessary skills to actually execute and support on that change as well. The next thing, as I touched on there, so if they don't have the skills, you start to see some second guessing, and that's where the anxiety kicks in as well. The next part is making sure that people have incentives. So if they're going to buy into, if they're going to support the change, if we're going to go on a journey from what we would call a public compliance safety culture through to a citizenship safety culture, is what's actually in it for people to buy into and support that change. What we can often fall into the trap of is thinking, well, the benefits of that are obvious. Is that, yes, people are more likely to go home safer at the end of the day and even in a better state to what they arrived at work, et cetera, zero harm, all of that sort of stuff. But what are we actually doing to appeal at the individual level in terms of what's most important to them around achieving this change? Not only that, but as they start to contribute to the change, what's the recognition? What are the rewards? What are the incentives coming back for them to help keep them on that journey that they started with and that they bought into at the start as well? I've never met any individual who has left an organization for feeling overvalued. So how do we actually make sure that as people buy into and support the change, that we're making sure they feel valued, that we're giving them incentives along the way? And that doesn't always have to be rewards. That can be recognition. It's the feedback to them that lets them know that, yep, I'm contributing to this change and I'm making a difference as part of this change process. And I'm getting some recognition along that journey, not just once we get to the end there as well. One thing I will invite you to do is, and this is me reflecting on where some organizations have got it wrong, is that as you provide those incentives, make sure whatever those incentives look like, and there's different schools of thought around this, make sure that those incentives directly tie back to the vision that you're trying to achieve and what an individual or a team or a collective group have done to contribute to achieving that particular vision. So if the vision is to be an organization with a strong reporting culture, we'll make sure that we're not just going, hey, here's your recognition or here's your reward, for supporting that. Directly tie, here's the incentive because you raised a stuck in our reporting process that we've now been able to fix to make it easier for people to report. You're acknowledging what an individual has directly done in order to help the organization achieve that particular vision. The next one is resources. Sorry, just to go back a step there. Without those incentives, is over time as you'll start to see that resistance kick in as well. So if you're seeing resistance from people, is the natural tendency to go back can be to go back and harp on around, hey, here's the vision, this is what we're trying to achieve. If you're seeing resistance, it's probably because we're not providing enough incentive or clear enough incentives around what that change is going to bring. The next one is around making sure that people have the resources. And this one has been particularly a topical one over the last couple of years for different organizations. Without the adequate resources, and whatever those resources might be, is you'll start to see a lot of frustration and people starting to get really agitated or flustered around what that change process is meaning for them. And we've seen a lot in different organizations over the last couple of years of people being asked to do more with less. The result from that is you get that frustration that starts to simmer across different individuals or across different teams. So making sure that people have adequate resources to actually buy in and support that change process as well. This is one, and I reflect on a few different organizations here in the safety culture change process they've got to. This is one that's often overlooked, is what it's going to look like is as part of going from a counterproductive culture, safety culture, through to what we might call a private culture, private compliance culture or mateship or citizenship, is we're going to build this safety leadership capability. And what we're going to do as part of that is we're going to roll out a safety leadership program. And then to make sure that then it gets applied in the field, we're going to ask people to, or invite people, to go through and undertake some in-field coaching. And then as part of that, we're also going to invite them to apply this new process of how they conduct safety interactions. And likewise, we want to actually transform how we use pre-starts to contribute to that vision that we're trying to achieve. Going through that process for a lot of leaders, what we're actually asking them to do is to put something extra on their plate. Is now you've got to go to coaching once a week, or now you've got to actually spend some time differently preparing for a pre-start, or now you actually got to take a few days out of your already busy schedule to go and attend this safety leadership training. When we're asking people to put something on their plate, we've also got to take something off that plate, or look at how we can reconfigure the plates so that people feel they have the resources, in this example, time, to be able to support that change as well. Without that, you'll get a lot of frustration. And as that frustration builds, you start to see people check out of that change as well. The next process there is around making sure that there's a clear action plan that supports the change. Now, that action plan, this is again where it can come undone for a lot of people, because what you'll get here is a lot of people now, they've got, there's a clear vision, they're aligned, there's consensus among key stakeholders and amongst the workforce. They've got the skills, there's clear incentives built in as part of that change. They've got the resources as well to support the change. But if it's not a well-articulated map or plan as to how we're actually going to roll out that change, is what you'll start to see is that treadmill effect, where people are just running but not actually getting anywhere as part of that, and they feel like this change actually isn't landing anywhere. We're not seeing the outcomes from it. We feel like we're just going round in circles on the spot. The action plan process is around making sure, and reflecting on a few different organizations that have gone through this process. One, that it's well articulated. Two, that it's easy for people to understand how A goes to B to C, etc., etc. But likewise, so that that action plan is actually achievable, because that action plan also needs to feed back to some of the other steps here in making sure that there's steps built in that action plan where it feels like, and certainly we are, creating momentum along that journey as well. That as part of that action plan, there's wins built in as part of that process, that we're celebrating those wins. We're not just going, we're going to execute that action plan and get to 3 years down the track and we'll see how we're going. Action plan is that critical step to get people to then jump into that action phase as well. One of the things I'll invite you to think about is that often as these change processes unfold, is a lot of organizations can tend to focus on the noisy, for want of a better term, few individuals or teams that are way down the other end of that normal distribution of resisting the change quite heavily. You'll also see organizations at the same time nurturing those that are the early adopters. What's often forgotten, though, is both the early and the late majority, which is usually the majority of the organization. The things that's, to come back to this model here, the things that will help the early and the late majority, so not the early adopters, the early majority and the late majority buy in and support that change, are going to be the skills, incentives, resources, and action plan. Those individuals that sit in those two categories, what they typically want to do is see people start to buy into and support the change before them. That's the purpose of, or the value rather, of those early adopters. But for those in the early or late majorities, they're generally willing to buy in and support the change as long as they see people achieving the change. So that's the vision, you can Sentis and your early adopters. But likewise, that they've got just those small tweaks, or those just, oh, we just need to change that, or we need this extra. If we had that, then yes, I can see how this will work. These are all the things that sit in the skills, your incentives, your resources, and your action plan as well. It's those ones, those individuals, those teams in the middle that only need just the one or two, maybe a few more things than that, to help them buy in, support the change. So making sure that we put focus on these things here, your skills, incentives, resources, and action plan, is critical to getting that group on board. Once you've got a good chunk of that group on board, is you're starting to look towards 70, 80% of people on board. And what you'll actually start to see as an end result of that is that those that were resisting the change earlier on are now actually starting to go, gee, I better jump on board here, because otherwise I'm gonna stand out like a sore thumb as not being on board with this change. And now you actually start to see a bit more of that bottom up change being driven, where people will go, gee, I better jump on board, otherwise I'm going to sit in sort of a small group here that are resisting the change. What will then happen is either they'll start to go, I'll jump on board, or maybe this is not the place for me, and they'll open themselves up for other opportunity as well. I just want to call at that point, because I think the early and the large and the late majority are often a group that's forgotten about in this change process, just in terms of, it can be the early adopters and those that are late down the process, so the resistors that can create the most noise. But it's that big group in the middle that only just need a few things to go their way for them to jump on board with the change. So what does this look like for a roadmap for success? The first thing I'd invite you to do in terms of going through this process is to look at, well, what's the data telling us? What's the story that sits around that data? And how do we turn that into a compelling vision that people can buy into? And you've heard the example before of Martin Luther King. That as a vision was so well articulated, and people could see that vision, that they're able to support and buy into that vision as part of that long process as well. And you know, that's quite a well-referenced example. There's other examples as well where, you know, we want to create this sort of organizational culture, or we want to create this sort of change, is it doesn't tell a story, it doesn't sell the why of what we're trying to achieve, and so it starts to fall over as well. The next one there is who are your key influencers, and who do you need to get on board? And what I'd invite you to think about as part of this process is not just look at who are my immediate key stakeholders, but to really take the time to reflect on who else in the organization do I need to have on board this process in order to drive that change? And this is where having run strategy workshops with different organizations this is an example of that, where you see organizations is they'll have executive representation. Excellent, you need that, absolutely. Then you have perhaps safety team representation, again, great. Then you'll have perhaps some operational leaders, or you'll have other parts of the business, and you might have your people and culture teams getting involved here as well, or your organizational transformation teams, or whatever that look like, getting involved. But then having also representation from the field or from the front line around operational or on the floor representation as part of that as well is also really key to help make sure that we're getting the key stakeholders right across the board that are actually supporting and can be aligned on that change as well. The next one is creating a strategy. So how will we go about executing that strategy? What does the strategy look like to achieve that particular vision? If we want to get to safety, to citizenship, and that is our safety culture, what is the strategy around that, and how does that support that particular vision as well? Likewise, how do we track success? What's the scoreboard that we're going to use to make sure that we're continuing along that journey, not just go, great, we understand where we are now, we want to be at citizenship in 4 years. How do we make sure that we're on the right path along that journey as well? The next one there is around implementing that plan. So making sure that we've got the skills, we've got the resources, that we've got the incentives in place, that we take the time to make sure that those things are set up properly before then going, great, let's launch the change, rather than just going, we've got the data, we've got people aligned, we've got a strategy, bang, here's the strategy. You get the pushback because people don't understand yet, or you haven't articulated well enough the steps involved to execute on that strategy. The last one there is, how do we make sure that we keep our finger on the pulse? And I referenced this a little bit earlier on, because part of mapping this out is also about looking at how we build that into step 3 and to step 4 as well. So what's the scoreboard that we're going to use to reference that people can actually then see momentum along that change journey as well? You can see this come undone sometimes, where people will go, great, this is a sort of culture that we want to create from going from here through to here, but there's nothing really to demonstrate that momentum, and people will often harbor quite negative frames around what has been. You've got to create that momentum, those wins, demonstrate those wins to show to people that, hey, we are creating momentum along this journey as well. That's particularly critical for your early majority and your late majority as well, as they need to see the rubber starting to hit the road and before they start to jump into the change as well. Again, capitalize on your early adopters there. The last part there as well is also looking at not just what it looks like for the safety team, but also thinking, what's this going to look like operationally? So it's not just seen as a safety initiative or a change process, but what are the impacts going to be beyond just the safety culture as well? An example of what this looks like, and I'm mindful of time, so I'll flick through this rather succinctly. This is in our Driving a Positive Safety Culture report that is online. If you jump on our website, you will see that. But one of our mining client that we work with is they went through a process of that first stage of understanding their safety culture, not just a quick sort of, you get a few data points, is understand what's driving, what's happening beneath the surface of not just what's happening, but why is it happening as well. They then went through a process of creating a steering committee that was going to drive the process, not just at the start, but over the multiple year project as part of that as well. To then spend some time as a senior leadership team mapping out, well, what does good actually look like? How will we know when we get to what good looks like? And it's not just a vision statement on a poster, but what does that actually look like for a frontline level as well? They then rolled out some targeted training programs, and that again was about giving people the skills, building in incentive plans, and giving them the skills for leaders to provide incentives as well as part of that step 4. And step 5 is looking at, well, what does it look like to embed that, to integrate that, so that this change initiative is now not something separate, but it's now just the way we do things and the way we the safety culture that is just now here at site. The impact of that, 45% reduction in LTIs over 2 years. Their reporting culture completely shifted as well. Likewise did their safety culture and safety leadership capability, but likewise their safety culture as well. The last point I wanted to get to, and this is particularly important, and when we partner with organizations, and likewise, if you do reach out as well, it's a conversation we'll have at the start to understand, well, yes, it's one thing to go through this safety culture change process, and here's going to be the benefits, et cetera, and the benefits are plenty, but looking at how do we make sure that this is sustained over the long term, that the energy is still there, that people are continually motivated, that there's that engagement over the long term as part of that as well. And often that requires tweaking and just changing things as part of that as well. The other part we'll invite is looking at how do you integrate that change process into just business as usual and what that looks like as well. I'm mindful of time, and I'm sure there's some questions that have come through, but I will just call out just a couple of, I guess, invitations here. Is that what we'll invite any organisation doing is before they begin a safety culture change process, rather than throwing a blanket over everything, is look at what's happening beneath the surface and what are the dials that we can turn up or we can turn down that are going to have the most impact on the safety culture. Rather than trying to change everything, is look at what are the levers that we can pull that are going to have the most impact on the safety culture, and how do we best go about shifting those levers as well. The next invitation I'll throw out to people as well is also what we call our safety essentials. And this is looking at now in the sort of world that we live in, where the notion of face-to-face programs and whatnot is not always now possible, is how do you actually drive cultural change where people can't necessarily come together? You've got a geographically dispersed workforce. And our safety essentials offering is actually about targeting that specifically. Is looking at, well, how do you enact safety culture change? We've got people perhaps all over the world, all over the country, wherever it might be, and still get the same outcomes that you would get from a face-to-face program as well. What I'll throw to now is a bit of Q&A. If there are any questions, Maddie.
Yes, thank you for that. Thanks so much, Ben. That was great. I will just reiterate that a recording and a podcast will be sent out on Monday. We did have a question earlier about whether the slides will be available, which Cassie has confirmed that we can get a PDF version out to you as well. So we will send that out on Monday too. So while we wait for any questions to come through, please pop them into the chat or the Q&A panel and I'll throw them out to Ben. Just while we wait, the part that really stuck out to me in particular is when people are comfortable, they won't want to change unless the benefits of changing far outweighs that comfort. Particularly your story about having broken your right shoulder. Is that right? Yeah, I'm naturally left-handed. So I have that mental cognition all the time trying to use right-handed tools, just part of everyday life. Perfect. Okay, so we have not had any questions come through. Oh, yeah, here we go. We've got one from Claire. You mentioned getting emotional buy-in. Coming from a support service area of the business, we already communicate frequently with staff. How do we differentiate those comms and their importance from other internal communications?
A very, very good question. I've seen this pop up a little bit of recent, where there's comms after comms after comms after comms. There's a lot of value in understanding what comms people want to receive and how they want to receive those comms as well. Is where I've seen a lot of organizations do it, is just try lots of different ways to communicate, different messages. And what ends up happening is that everything becomes important, and the result from that is that then nothing's important. What I invite you to do, and this is part of engaging with key stakeholders, is to look at what are some different ways that you can communicate that particular message that you might not have before. And that might be engaging with, with frontline workers as an example. Say, hey, what sorts of, mediums of communicating a message really resonate with you and your colleagues, or what do you need to see differently in terms of how we communicate different messages? Doing that, I think you'd be surprised at some of the responses you get as part of that as well, that we've always just communicated through these means, and obviously digital particularly a lot at the moment. So, understanding, what are some different ways that you'd want to receive that message, and see what you get, and then try it and then tweak and whatnot from there. So hopefully that answers your question somewhat clear.
Thank you. We have another one from Marina. So milestones along the way. Did you have any to share with the participants who are undergoing the change to help them see progress? Was that rewarding?
Yep. Where we've seen that land the best is where, so let's say, for example, you're going to roll out a safety leadership program, is you'll start to see particular individuals in programs and the different levels of leadership really buy in and drive the change. Is getting them involved very, very early, and you've got to pick the people, because not everyone likes this, but almost sort of highlighting, here we've got Brian, and Brian's, done this with his team and he's been able to achieve this as a result. The other thing as well, though, is from a senior leadership point of view, is making sure that they're really, I'm yet to see a senior leader overdo it. And I think you know what I mean by that, in terms of really demonstrating the change, that, hey, I went through this program and here's how I'm applying those tools and what that looks like for us in our roles on a day-to-day basis, rather than just being, some content as part of that as well. So for a senior leadership team, particularly early on, is not just communicating that change in terms of, hey, here's what we want people to do, be the change, and look for opportunities to build that demonstration in of what that looks like as well.
Perfect. And we have one last question from Ray. And they say, I find the greatest challenge to safety change is managers who are KPI motivated. I guess they're asking if you have any advice for that.
Yep. Again, another common thing that pops up for those that are KPI motivated is looking at how you can link the safety culture. And I know this can be easier said than done sometimes, is looking how you can link the journey you're about to embark on with the KPIs and the impact on their KPIs that it's going to have. And that can be understanding in depth sometimes, things that contribute to their KPIs, and looking at how you can tell a story around what that change process is going to look like and how it's going to impact upon their KPIs as well. Now, if that's not as a direct link, is actually linking in with them to see, hey, as part of this change process we're going to embark on, help me better understand your KPIs and how we can actually build that into what we're trying to achieve as part of this process as well.
Oh, sorry, I've just had one more question.
I was just going to add
last question before we end this webinar today. I have a question from Neil. He says, Ben, do you find that organizational change WRTHSE requires any specific focuses or targets that is different to other organization change? Example, HR, new payroll package, moving to GPS in a survey, etc.
Yep. For this one, I think the challenge for a lot of safety professionals is the impact on key business metrics. So, financial metrics, as an example, is often something that safety leaders don't like to tip into, because they don't like to associate that with safety change. If you're looking to drive safety culture change right across an organization, or certainly a large part of the organization, is make sure, my invitation would be to tip into that, is to look at how can I tell the story of this change process and the impact that that's going to have on the things that are most important to the executive and are most important, often in many instances, to the board. So where we've got, perhaps might be, outcomes around, we're going to see people, more motivated to do X, Y, Z. Yes, that's important, but the board are going to have a completely, or not completely different, but they're going to have a different sort of focus area to what safety professionals might have in how they reference some of those metrics as well. So understanding what some of their metrics are, or what some of their focus areas are, and how you can attach the impact it's going to have from a safety point of view to what those metrics are going to be as well.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to cap the questions up there just because I'm wary of everybody's time. But thank you so much for your presentation today, Ben. If anybody in the chat hasn't had their question answered, again, we're sending out a video podcast and the PDF slides out on Monday. But if you would love to get your questions answered or reach out, please reach out to Ben. His email and link is on the screen right now, and he and the Sentis team will be able to help you out. But again, thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. See ya.
Thanks very much, everyone.